coffee was terrible, but Cadet Elena Vance drank it anyway because terrible coffee was better than no coffee at all. And she had learned that lesson during her first year at the academy, when she had gone 3 days without any caffeine and had nearly failed her navigation exam as a result. She sat in the observation deck of listening post Theta 9, her legs tucked beneath her in the worn chair that had become her favorite spot over the past 4 months. And she watched the stars drift slowly past the viewport as the station completed its endless rotation around this forgotten corner of space. The Gemini Council had sent her here as a punishment, or at least that was what everyone believed, because she had talked back to a Velian ambassador who had insulted her planet and her species in front of the entire diplomatic corps. And the council had decided that 6 months of isolation would teach her some manners and some respect for her galactic betters. Elena took another sip of her terrible coffee and smiled at the memory of the ambassador's face when she had calmly explained to him exactly what humans thought of species who had never had to fight for their survival. And the smile grew wider when she remembered how he had turned 3 different shades of purple before storming out of the chamber. She did not regret it, not even a little bit, because this station was quiet and peaceful, and she had all the time in the world to read and think and train, and spend time with Constantine. A heavy weight pressed against her leg, and she looked down to see her companion settling his massive head on her thigh, his amber eyes half closed in contentment as she began to scratch behind his ears with her free hand. Constantine was a Terran mauler, and he was the most beautiful and terrifying creature she had ever known, with 800 pounds of muscle and armor-like hide and claws that could tear through metal like paper. And she loved him more than she had ever loved anything in her entire life. They had grown up together on Earth, in the Northern Territories where the winters were harsh and the wildlife was harsher. And she had found him as a cub when his mother had been killed by a rival male during a territorial dispute that had left 3 adult maulers dead and 1 tiny orphan crying in the snow. Elena had been 12 years old when she carried him home wrapped in her jacket, and her parents had told her she was crazy and that she would get herself killed. But she had looked into those golden eyes and seen something that recognized her as a kindred spirit, and she had known in that moment that they belonged together. The other species in the hegemony did not understand the bond between humans and their companion animals, and they thought it was madness to share your life and your home with creatures that could kill you without even trying. But they had never lived on Earth, and they had never understood what it meant to survive on a world that was constantly trying to murder everything that walked or crawled or swam across its surface. Earth was what the galaxy called a death world, a planet where the gravity was crushing and the climate was unstable, and every single species had evolved to be either a predator or prey, and usually both at the same time. Humans had no claws and no fangs and no armor and no venom, and by all logic, they should have gone extinct millions of years ago, eaten by the countless monsters that shared their world. But instead they had done something that no other species in the known galaxy had ever managed to do. They had looked at the wolves and the big cats and the birds of prey and all the other killers that surrounded them, and instead of running away or hiding in caves forever, they had walked up to those predators and said, "Do you want to work together?" And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, the predators had said yes. Constantine rumbled deep in his chest, a sound of pure contentment that vibrated through Elena's entire body, and she smiled down at him as she continued to scratch that spot behind his ear that always made him melt into a puddle of deadly muscle and sharp teeth. "You are such a baby," she told him, and he opened one eye to look at her with an expression that clearly said he did not care what she called him as long as she kept scratching. The sensor console beeped softly, and Elena glanced over at it without much interest because the sensors beeped all the time out here, picking up cosmic radiation and asteroid fragments and the occasional trading ship passing through on its way to somewhere more interesting. But then the console beeped again, and the tone was different this time, sharper and more urgent. And Elena felt Constantine's muscles tense beneath her hand as he lifted his head and turned toward the sound. She set down her coffee mug and walked over to the console, and what she saw made her heart beat just a little bit faster. Not with fear, but with something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. 3 ships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and their signatures were not in any hegemony database, which meant they were either unregistered merchants trying to avoid customs fees or something much more dangerous. Elena pulled up the detailed scan results and studied the ship configurations, and she felt a cold smile spread across her face as she recognized the distinctive angular design and the weapon placements, and the hull markings that identified them as belonging to the Valdrix hunting clans. The Valdrix were not members of the hegemony, and they were not welcome in hegemony space, and they were definitely not supposed to be anywhere near a listening post that was staffed by a single human cadet and her 800-pound companion. Constantine had risen to his feet now, and he stood beside her with his eyes fixed on the viewport. And Elena could feel the tension in his body and the readiness in every line of his powerful frame. And she knew that he understood exactly what those ships meant. "Wow," she said to him, reaching out to rest her hand on his broad head. "It looks like our vacation is about to get a lot more interesting." She turned back to the console and began to calculate how long it would take the ships to reach the station. And she was pleased to discover that she had at least an hour before they arrived, which was plenty of time to finish her coffee and change into something more appropriate for receiving guests. Elena was not afraid because fear was something that happened to other people, to species who had not grown up learning that the universe was full of things that wanted to kill them and that the only way to survive was to be smarter and tougher and more stubborn than anything else out there. She was human, and she had Constantine, and whatever the Valdrix thought they were coming here to find, she was absolutely certain that they were going to be very, very surprised. Commander Sithrak stood on the bridge of his hunting vessel and gazed at the small station that floated in the darkness ahead, and his long forked tongue flickered out to taste the recycled air as anticipation built in his chest like a fire waiting to consume everything in its path. He was tall even by Valdrix standards, with scales the color of dried blood and eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. And he had been hunting across the galaxy for nearly 200 years and had claimed more trophies than any other commander in the history of his clan. The walls of his personal quarters were covered with the skulls of 100 different species, each one a testament to his skill and his patience and his absolute mastery of the art of fear. And soon he would add another skull to that collection, a human skull, and it would be the crown jewel of everything he had ever accomplished. "Commander," his lieutenant called from the sensor station. "The scan is complete, and I can confirm there is only one life form on the station. A human female, young, and she appears to be alone except for an animal companion of some kind." Sithrak turned to look at the data that scrolled across the screen, and he felt his hunting instincts sharpen as he studied the information about his prey, because this was the moment he loved most. The moment before the chase began, when everything was still potential and possibility. Humans were relatively new to the galactic stage, having only achieved faster-than-light travel a few decades ago, and most species considered them to be weak and primitive and utterly unremarkable. With their soft skin and their flat teeth and their complete lack of any natural weapons or defenses. But Sithrak knew something that most species did not know, something that made humans the most valuable prey in the entire galaxy. And that something was the way they experienced fear. The Valdrix had evolved not as simple predators, but as something far more sophisticated. As hunters who fed not on flesh but on the hormones and chemicals that terrified prey, released into their bloodstreams during moments of extreme stress. And different species produced different flavors of fear. some bland and forgettable, and others rich and complex and absolutely intoxicating. Human fear was the most exquisite substance in the known universe. A cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol and a dozen other chemicals that created a taste so intense and so satisfying that a single human could provide more nourishment than a dozen members of any other species. The reason for this was simple. Humans had evolved on a world that was constantly trying to kill them, and their bodies had developed the most powerful fear response in the galaxy as a survival mechanism, flooding their systems with enough chemicals to give them the strength and speed they needed to escape from the countless predators that had hunted them throughout their history. That same fear response made them the perfect prey for the Valdrix, and Sithrak had been waiting for an opportunity like this for a very long time. What kind of animal companion? He asked his lieutenant, because even the smallest details could be important when planning a hunt. The lieutenant studied the scan results and then looked up with an expression that might have been concern on a species capable of feeling such emotions. It is a large quadruped of Terran origin, Commander, something called a mauler according to the hegemony databases, and it appears to weigh approximately 800 of the human units called pounds. Sithrak considered this information for a moment and then dismissed it with a wave of his clawed hand. Because what did it matter if the human had a pet, even a large one, when he had 6 trained hunters and enough firepower to destroy the entire station if necessary? We will kill the animal first, he decided, and we will make the human watch as we do it, because there is nothing that produces better fear than watching something you love die slowly and painfully. His hunters gathered around him as he outlined the plan. 6 warriors who had been with him for decades and who had proven themselves in countless hunts across hundreds of worlds. And each of them carried plasma weapons that could burn through armor and flesh with equal ease. They would breach the station's airlock and move quickly through the corridors, and they would find the human before she had time to hide or call for help, and then the real hunt would begin. Remember, Sithrak told them, we want her alive and conscious for as long as possible, because the fear must build slowly if we are to extract the maximum nourishment from her, and I want this one to last for days. The hunters acknowledged his orders with sharp nods and hungry expressions, and Sithrak felt the thrill of the hunt singing through his veins as the ships moved closer to the station and the moment of breach approached. He had studied humans extensively before planning this hunt, reading every report and watching every recording he could find, and he knew that they were a species prone to panic and desperation when faced with superior force, just like every other soft and weak prey species he had ever encountered. They had no natural armor to protect them, no claws or fangs to fight back with, no venom or poison to make them dangerous. And their only real advantage was their intelligence, which would do them no good when they were surrounded by hunters with weapons and no way to escape. The human female on this station was young and alone and completely cut off from any help. And by the time anyone realized she was missing, Sithrak and his hunters would be long gone, leaving nothing behind but an empty station and the mystery of what had happened to its single occupant. The airlock is in range, the pilot announced, and Sithrak gathered his hunters and moved toward the boarding tube that would carry them across the void and into the station. He imagined the moment when the human would first see them, the way her eyes would widen and her breath would catch, and her wonderful, delicious fear would begin to flood her system, and he could almost taste it already. This was going to be the greatest hunt of his entire life, a hunt that would be remembered and celebrated by his clan for generations to come, and he would finally have the trophy that he had been dreaming of for years. The Valdrix did not know mercy, and they did not know hesitation, because they were the ultimate predators of the galaxy, the hunters who hunted hunters, and nothing had ever stood against them and survived. What Sithrak did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that he had made a terrible mistake in choosing this particular human and this particular station and this particular moment to begin his hunt. He had studied humans, but he had not understood them. And he had seen their weakness, but he had not seen their strength. And he had calculated the danger of the Mauler companion, but he had completely failed to grasp what it meant that a human would choose to share her life with such a creature. The boarding tube connected with a clang that echoed through both vessels, and Sithrak led his hunters forward into the station with his weapon raised and his senses alert for any sign of his prey. He was ready for screaming and running and hiding and begging, ready for all the things that prey always did when the Valdrix came hunting. And he was absolutely certain that this hunt would go exactly like every other hunt he had ever conducted. He was wrong, and he was about to discover just how wrong he was. But by the time he understood the truth, it would be far, far too late to do anything about it. The airlock breach alarm screamed through the station like a wounded animal, red lights flashing in every corridor and every room. And Elena took one last sip of her coffee before deciding that it had finally cooled to the perfect temperature, and she might as well bring it with her. She had changed out of her sleep clothes and into her regulation boots and her favorite Academy hoodie, the gray one with the Earth Forces logo on the back that she had worn so many times the fabric was soft and comfortable. And she had pulled her dark hair back into a practical tail that would keep it out of her face. Constantine walked beside her as she made her way toward the common area, and his movements were silent despite his massive size. 800 pounds of muscle and claw and fang moving like a shadow through the station's corridors. His eyes had shifted from their usual warm amber to something brighter and more intense, a deep gold that seemed to glow in the flashing red light of the alarms. And Elena could feel the tension in his body and the readiness in every step he took. She reached down to touch his head as they walked, a gentle reminder that she was there and that they were in this together. And he pressed briefly against her hand before returning his attention to the corridor ahead. The Valdrix were not being subtle about their approach, and Elena could hear them crashing through the station's halls, their clawed feet scraping against the metal floors, and their voices calling to each other in their harsh language as they searched for their prey. She reached the common area and settled into her favorite chair, the one by the viewport where she had spent so many hours reading and drinking coffee and watching the stars. And she crossed her legs and took another sip from her mug as she waited for her guests to arrive. Constantine positioned himself beside her chair, his body low and his muscles coiled, and Elena rested one hand on his broad back and felt the vibration of a growl building deep in his chest. "Not yet," she told him softly, and he fell silent immediately, waiting for a signal, trusting her completely, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to attack. The Valdrix burst through the doorway in a rush of scales and weapons. 6 of them plus a 7th, who was obviously the leader based on his size and the way he held himself. And they spread out across the room with their plasma rifles raised and ready to fire. Elena did not move, did not flinch, did not do anything except take another calm sip of her coffee and watch them over the rim of her mug. The leader stopped so suddenly that one of his hunters almost ran into him, and Elena could see the confusion spreading across his reptilian features as he tried to understand what he was seeing, because this was not how prey was supposed to behave. "You are early," Elena said, her voice as calm and casual as if she were greeting an old friend. "I calculated you would take at least 4 more minutes to breach the airlock. So either your pilot is better than I expected or your equipment is better than the standard Valdrix configuration." The leader stared at her with his obsidian eyes, and Elena could see him trying to process this situation that was so completely different from everything he had expected. And she felt a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Human," he finally said, his voice a harsh rasp that sounded like stones grinding together. "You will surrender yourself immediately for transport to our vessel. where you will provide us with many hours of entertainment before we finally allow you to die." Elena took another sip of her coffee and considered his words with the same expression she might have used while considering what to have for lunch. "That is an interesting proposal," she said, "but I am afraid I will have to decline, because I have not finished my coffee yet, and I never make important decisions before I have finished my coffee." The Valdrix hunters exchanged glances that clearly communicated their confusion, because they had hunted hundreds of species across thousands of worlds, and they had never encountered anything like this. Prey that sat calmly and made jokes while surrounded by armed warriors. "You do not seem to understand your situation," the leader growled, taking a step toward her. "You are alone and unarmed and completely helpless, and there is nothing you can do to stop us from taking you." Elena smiled, and it was not a friendly smile, and it was not a scared smile, and it was not the kind of smile that the Valdrix had ever seen on the face of Prey before. "I am not alone," she said, and she lifted her hand from Constantine's back and spoke, a single word in a voice that was still perfectly calm and perfectly controlled. "Guard." Constantine exploded into motion like a force of nature, like an earthquake and a hurricane and a wildfire all compressed into 800 pounds of armored muscle and razor-sharp claws. And the nearest Valdrix hunter did not even have time to scream before those claws tore through his chest and sent him crashing to the floor in a spray of dark blood. Elena raised her coffee mug to her lips and took another sip as Constantine spun toward the second hunter, his jaws closing around the warrior's throat and crushing it like paper. And she noted with satisfaction that the coffee was still at the perfect temperature. The remaining hunters tried to fire their weapons, but Constantine was moving too fast, weaving between them like smoke. And every time a plasma bolt flew through the air, he was already somewhere else, already tearing into another target with claws and fangs that had been designed by millions of years of evolution on the deadliest planet in the galaxy. The third hunter fell with his weapon arm torn completely off, and the fourth fell with his chest ripped open, and the fifth managed to fire one shot that scorched the line across Constantine's armored hide before those terrible jaws found his face and ended his hunt forever. Elena watched it all with the same calm expression she had worn since the Valdrix had entered the room, and she did not flinch when blood splattered across the viewport, and she did not look away when the screaming started and then stopped with horrible suddenness. The sixth hunter tried to run, tried to flee back through the doorway and escape this nightmare that had descended upon them. But Constantine was faster, always faster, and he caught the fleeing warrior before he had taken 3 steps and brought him down with a single swipe of his massive paw. And then there was only the leader, Commander Sithrak, pressed against the far wall, with his weapon hanging forgotten at his side, and his obsidian eyes wide with something that Elena recognized immediately, something that she had seen 1,000 times on the faces of predators, who had finally realized that they were not the most dangerous thing in the room. It was fear, pure and perfect and absolutely delicious. And Elena smiled as she took one final sip of her coffee and set the mug down on the arm of her chair. Constantine stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the bodies of the hunters who had thought they were the ultimate predators, and his golden eyes were fixed on the last surviving Valdrix with an intensity that promised death was only a heartbeat away. "Now then," Elena said, rising from her chair and walking toward the terrified commander, with Constantine falling into step beside her. "I think it is time we had a conversation about why you are here and what you thought was going to happen." Sithrak could not speak, could not move, could only stare at the human and her monster as they approached him, and for the first time in 200 years of hunting, he understood what it felt like to be prey. Commander Sithrak had never known fear before this moment. Not in 200 years of hunting across 1,000 worlds. Not when he had faced down armed warriors and dangerous beasts and desperate prey fighting for their lives. because he had always been the predator and he had always been in control. But now he was pressed against the cold metal wall of this tiny station, surrounded by the cooling bodies of his hunters. And he was looking into the eyes of a young human female who was walking toward him with the same casual confidence that he had seen in his own reflection for his entire life. The monster walked beside her, its golden eyes fixed on him, its massive body still dripping with the blood of his warriors. And Sithrak could see now that it was not a pet or a trained animal or anything else that he had assumed, because there was intelligence in those eyes, ancient and terrible intelligence that recognized him as prey. "Please," he heard himself say, and he was shocked to hear his own voice begging, to hear the same words that he had heard from so many victims over so many years. "Please, do not kill me." The human stopped a few feet away from him and tilted her head to one side, studying him with an expression that was curious rather than angry. And she reached up to rest her hand on the monster's broad head in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. "You came here to hunt me," she said, and her voice was calm and conversational. "You came here to capture me and torture me and harvest my fear for your own pleasure. And now you are asking me for mercy?" Sithrak did not know what to say, did not know how to respond to this creature who had turned everything he knew about the universe completely upside down, because he had spent his entire life believing that humans were weak and helpless and existed only to be preyed upon by stronger species. "I want you to understand something," the human continued, and she began to scratch behind the monster's ear in a way that made it lean into her touch and rumble with what sounded almost like contentment. "I want you to understand why you made such a terrible mistake coming here." She gestured at the bodies scattered across the room, and Sithrak forced himself to look at what remained of his hunters. Warriors who had survived countless battles and who had been torn apart in a matter of seconds by something they had dismissed as nothing more than a pet. "Your species studied humans before you came here, did you not?" she asked, and Sithrak managed to nod weakly, his eyes still fixed on the monster that could end his life at any moment. "You read the reports and watched the recordings, and you decided that we were perfect prey because we have no natural weapons and no armor and no venom." The monster shifted its weight, and Sithrak flinched, but it did not attack, just continued to watch him with those terrible golden eyes while the human kept scratching its ear like it was nothing more than an oversized pet. "But you missed the most important thing about humans," she said. "You missed the thing that makes us different from every other species in the galaxy. The thing that allowed us to survive on a world that should have killed us 1,000,000 times over." She stopped scratching, and the monster turned its massive head to look at her. And there was something in the way they looked at each other that Sithrak did not understand. Something that went beyond owner and pet, beyond trainer and trained animal. "Earth is a death world," the human said, "and everything that lives there has evolved to be a killer, from the smallest insect to the largest predator. And humans had no claws or fangs or armor to protect ourselves from all those killers." She smiled, and it was a strange smile, almost sad in a way that Sithrak could not comprehend. "So we did something that no other species in the history of the galaxy has ever done," she continued. "Instead of running from the predators and hiding from the monsters, we walked up to them and we said, 'Do you want to be friends?'" Sithrak stared at her, unable to process what she was saying, because it made no sense. Because you could not befriend things that wanted to eat you. Because the relationship between predator and prey was fundamental to the way the universe worked. "We took wolves and we turned them into dogs," the human said. "We took wildcats and we turned them into companions. We took birds of prey and we hunted with them. And we took creatures like Constantine here, and we raised them from cubs, and we loved them, and they loved us back." She reached out and wrapped her arms around the monster's thick neck, pressing her face against its blood-soaked fur in a gesture of absolute trust and absolute affection. and the monster made a sound that Sithrak had never heard before. A deep rumbling purr that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. "This is not a pet," the human said, lifting her face to look at him. "This is not an animal that I have trained to obey commands. This is my partner and my friend, and the creature I love more than anything else in the universe." She released the monster and stood up straight, and there was something in her eyes now that made Sithrak feel very small and very afraid. "I bottle-fed him when he was a cub," she said. "I stayed up all night with him when he was sick. I sat with him through 2 surgeries, and I cried when I thought he might not survive. And he sleeps at the foot of my bed and steals food from my plate and gets jealous when I pay attention to other people." The monster pressed against her side, and she reached down to touch its head. And Sithrak finally understood what he was seeing, finally understood why he had made such a terrible mistake. "Humans do not domesticate predators," the human said. "We do not break them or control them or force them to obey us. We build relationships with them based on trust and love and mutual respect. And in return, they choose to stand beside us against anything that threatens us." She took a step toward him, and Sithrak pressed himself harder against the wall, wishing he could disappear into the metal, wishing he could go back in time and choose a different target on a different world. "You came here to hunt something you thought was helpless," she said. "But here is the truth about humans. Commander, here is the thing your species never understood and will never understand." She was standing right in front of him now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that he could smell the strange scent of the beverage she had been drinking. "We are never helpless," she said, "because we are never alone. Because every wolf and every hawk and every lion and every creature with claws and fangs and killing instinct looked at us soft, weak humans and decided that we were worth protecting." The monster moved to stand beside her, its massive head level with her shoulder, and it looked at Sithrak with eyes that promised death if he made a single wrong move. "We did not conquer Earth by being the strongest or the fastest or the most deadly," the human said. "We conquered Earth by making friends with everything that was stronger and faster and more deadly than us." She reached up and scratched under the monster's chin, and it closed its eyes in pleasure while still somehow managing to keep its attention fixed on Sithrak. "And those friends will follow us anywhere," she said. "To other worlds, to other stars, to the edge of the galaxy and beyond. And they will tear apart anything that tries to hurt us. Because that is what friends do for each other." Sithrak finally understood, finally grasped the terrible truth that his species had never comprehended. And he felt something he had never felt before in his entire 200 years of life. He felt small, and he felt afraid, and he felt like prey. 3 weeks had passed since the Valdrix hunting party had attacked listening post Theta 9. And the hegemony patrol ship that finally arrived to investigate found something very different from what they had expected. Captain Velris of the patrol vessel Vigilant had received reports of unusual activity in the sector. Strange energy signatures and communications, blackouts that suggested something had gone very wrong at the remote listening post. And he had prepared his crew for the worst as they approached the station. He had expected to find a destroyed station and a dead human cadet. Another victim of the lawless borders, where the hegemony's protection was weak in predators. Like the Valdrix roam freely looking for easy prey. What he found instead was Cadet Elena, Vance sitting in the observation deck with a cup of coffee in her hand and a datapad in her lap, calmly working through her backlog of sensor logs as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "Cadet Vance," he said, his 4 eyes blinking in confusion as he looked around the station that showed obvious signs of violence. Scorch marks on the walls and dark stains on the floors that had clearly been cleaned, but not completely removed. What happened here? Elena looked up from her datapad and smiled at him with an expression that seemed genuinely pleased to see visitors. "Captain Valrus, "Thank you for coming," she said. "I apologize for not sending a proper distress signal, but the Valdrix damaged my long-range communications array when they breached the station, and I have not had time to repair it yet." She gestured toward the corridor that led to the storage compartments, and Valorous noticed for the first time the massive creature that lay curled up in a patch of artificial sunlight near the viewport, an 800-pound predator that opened one golden eye to observe him, before apparently deciding he was not a threat and going back to sleep. "You will find Commander Sithrek of the Valdrix hunting clans in storage compartment 3, Elena continued. "I have been providing him with food and water and adequate sanitation facilities, and he is unharmed, although somewhat traumatized by his experience here." Varus stared at her for a long moment, trying to understand what she was telling him, because it sounded like she was saying that she had single-handedly captured a Valdrix hunting commander while his warriors lay dead around her. "The commander is alive?" he asked, and Elena nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the universe. "I thought it would be more useful to keep him alive," she explained. "Dead hunters cannot tell anyone what happened here, and I wanted to make sure that the Valdrix understood exactly what they had encountered." She stood up and walked toward the corridor, and Valorous followed her because he did not know what else to do. And the massive predator rose from its spot in the sunlight and padded along beside her like a loyal dog following its master. Commander Sithrek was exactly where Elena had said he would be, locked in a storage compartment that had been converted into a surprisingly comfortable cell, with a sleeping pad and a portable waste unit and several containers of emergency rations. He looked up when the door opened, and Valorous saw something in the Valdrix commander's eyes that he had never seen before in a member of that species. Something that looked very much like fear mixed with a strange kind of respect. "You see," Sithrek said, his voice hoarse and his scales dull from weeks of captivity. "You see what she is, what they all are, and you must tell everyone, you must warn them." Valorous looked at Elena, who was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed and an expression of mild amusement on her face. And then he looked back at the Valdrix commander, who was supposed to be one of the most dangerous hunters in the galaxy. "What happened here?" he asked, and Sithrek began to talk, words pouring out of him in a rush, as if he had been waiting for weeks to tell someone what he had witnessed. He told them about the hunt and the attack, and the way the human had sat calmly drinking her beverage, while his warriors died around her. And he told them about the monster that had killed 6 armed hunters in less than a minute without taking a single serious wound. He told them about the conversation afterward, about the human's explanation of how her species had survived on their death world by befriending the very predators that should have killed them. And he told them about the terrible calm in her eyes as she described the bond between humans and their companion animals. "She is not prey," Sithrek said, and his voice was hollow with the weight of understanding. "None of them are prey. They never were prey. And every species that has ever looked at humans and seen weakness has made the same mistake that I made." He reached through the bars of his cell and grabbed Valorous by the arm, his claws digging into the captain's uniform as he stared at him with desperate intensity. "Tell everyone," he begged. "Tell the hunting clans and the hegemony and every species that has ever thought about attacking a human. Tell them what I have learned at the cost of everything I'd ever believed." Valorous pulled his arm free and stepped back, and he looked at Elena, who was still watching with that same expression of mild amusement. And he understood finally why the Valdrix commander was so afraid. "What do you want me to tell them?" he asked, and Elena smiled a smile that was warm and friendly, and somehow more terrifying than anything Sithrek had said. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them that humans are never alone, that wherever we go, we bring our friends with us, and that those friends will protect us against anything that tries to hurt us." She reached down to rest her hand on the head of her companion, and the massive predator pressed against her leg and rumbled with contentment. "Tell them that Earth made us this way," she continued, that we survived our world by building bonds with creatures that could kill us, and that those bonds are stronger than any weapon or any army or any hunting clan. She turned and walked back toward the observation deck, and Valorous followed her because he still had so many questions and so few answers. "Why did you spare him?" he asked, gesturing back toward the storage compartment where Sithric was still locked in his cell. "He came here to torture you and kill you. Why did you not let your companion finish him?" Elena stopped and turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that was not anger and not hatred, but something more complicated. Something that might have been pity or might have been understanding. "Because someone needs to tell the story," she said. "Because the Valdrix and all the other species that think humans are easy targets need to hear what happened here from one of their own." She looked out the viewport at the stars that stretched endlessly in all directions, and her companion came to stand beside her, pressing against her side in a gesture of comfort and support. "We are not a violent species," she said. "We do not want to fight, and we do not want to kill. But we will protect ourselves, and we will protect each other, and nothing in this galaxy will ever change that." Valorous took Sithrak back to hegemony space, and the Valdrix commander told his story to everyone who would listen, and the story spread across the galaxy like a fire burning through dry grass. The Valdrix hunting clans heard about the human girl and her monster, and they quietly removed humans from their list of acceptable targets. The Hegemony Council heard about the bond between humans and their companion animals, and they reclassified Terran predators from dangerous fauna to sapient-adjacent combat partners with full legal protections. And in the dark spaces between the stars, wherever hunters gathered to share tales of their greatest victories and their most terrible defeats, a new rule began to spread. Never target a human alone, because they are never really alone. Because somewhere nearby, there is always a creature with claws and fangs that loves them and will die to protect them. Elena stayed at listening post 8 and 9 for another 2 months, until her rotation finally ended and she was recalled to the academy to continue her training. And when she left, she took Constantine with her in a commendation from the Hegemony Council for exceptional performance under pressure. Her commanding officer had asked her if she needed counseling for the trauma of the attack, and she had seemed genuinely confused by the question. "Trauma?" she had said. "No, sir. Constantine got some exercise, and I caught up on my reading, and I did not even spill my coffee." She had paused then, and a small smile had crossed her face. "Well, not much of it anyway." And the galaxy continued to learn what Earth had always known, that humans were not the deadliest thing their planet had produced, but they were the thing that had made friends with everything deadlier. That was the truth about humanity, the simple and terrifying truth that the Valdrix had learned, and that every other species would eventually learn as well. Humans do not conquer by force, they conquer by friendship, and that friendship is the most powerful weapon in the entire universe.